I've always said that this wasn't going to be an easy transition to democracy because the regime that we uprooted had a chance to embed itself for 30 years. That's not something that's going to be taken care of in a 2-year transition period. I hope that we can exercise patience and that the international community that's involved in Sudan exercises that patience, as well as advocates for transitional justice mechanisms for supporting people economically and infrastructure-wise, given the current situation as well, and providing the much-needed humanitarian relief throughout the entire country.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Aida Abbashar, who is a PhD candidate at Durham University and a research assistant for the LSE's Middle East Centre project, Understanding the Barriers and Enablers to Women Leadership in Sudan. Aida, thanks for coming on the series.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So just for a little context for our listeners, I reached out to you about maybe a week ago because I wanted to have a sort of first principles conversation about what's happening in Sudan. And it's very much a selfish desire for me, because I realize that I don't know enough to know what are intelligent questions to ask. And I'm reading the news, I'm trying to understand what's happening, and I don't have the historical context for what's going on, and I very much want that context. So I was hoping to have an hour-long conversation with you to say, where are good places to look? What are questions worth asking to understand how we got here and where we might be going? So with that, at the jump, I said you're a PhD candidate at Durham University. How about you tell us a little bit about what your PhD is in and what you have been studying these days?
Sure. So my PhD focuses on the history of constitution making in Sudan. So I'm looking at the different actors, policies, and events that have shaped constitution making since Sudan has gained independence in 1956. Within that, I'm looking at what are the big constitutional issues or the big constitutional questions that political elites have been discussing with each other since the country has gained independence, as well as trying to shed light on people's popular imagining. So what is it that the Sudanese people hope to enshrine in a country's permanent constitution? Or what are their demands? And how does a constitution reflect or not reflect people's realities on the ground?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, if we think about like the 1950s, if I was speaking to, your grandparents' friends, right? And social circles. And I asked them at the time, what will Sudan look like in 70 years? What do you think they would have said?
I think what it is that people had hopes for an independent Sudan, which was gained. In the 1950s, Sudan was one of the first African countries to gain independence from the British. But I don't think people would have expected the amount of interference from the military, the amount of coups that have occurred over Sudan's history, nor the amount of revolutions either. So Sudan has been kind of on this cycle of frequent transitions, transitional periods where things are written up, political declarations, constitutions that are then discarded, and then other patterns of coups and similar political elites occupying these political spaces. I would also say that they probably wouldn't have imagined that the conflict in the country would grow to this scale throughout the entire country and in the south as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's kind of set the stage a little bit. I opened the newspaper, like me and you are sitting next to each other at a coffee shop or on the train or wherever. And you overhear me saying, "Oh, it's crazy what's happening in Sudan right now. Like, when did this all start?" What do you say to yourself when you hear me say that? Sort of, what do you say sort of under your breath? Like, "Oh, yeah, it didn't just start." When did it start?
Yeah, I mean, when this situation started, I would peg it to the 1989 regime of Omar Al-Bashir, who took power and ruled Sudan for 30 years, and then was brought down by popular uprising in April of 2019. And the reason why I say that is the security sector in Sudan, which I think is something that listeners should really try to read more about and pay attention to. The security sector in Sudan is very distinctive in the sense that when Bashir took power, along with uprooting remnants of previous regimes, he also uprooted the security sector. That meant ensuring that there were loyalists to his regime, part of the security sector, and also ensuring that he had complete control over that. And the reason being is because Sudan's history tells us, especially since independence in 1956, as I said earlier, that Sudan's army has played a big role in changing the course of the country's events. And the army has been responsible for coup attempts, successful coups, and Sudan's security sector was empowered by like Egyptian and British colonialism, but then came to form its own distinctive character, ruling throughout the country in various ways. And so when we think about Omar al-Bashir's regime in 1989 and the Aqaz regime and what that means, we see that these characters of Hemeti and Burhan, who have arisen in the current context as the main players, didn't fall out of thin air. Rather, they were empowered by a regime over the last 30 years. They were mobilized, they were trained, they were given authority, they were given troops, and that these are all rooted in the previous regime and what it created.
I know I said that I was going to start there, but it just got me thinking, where did Omar al-Bashir come from? I mean, like, was he a sort of an army, was he a soldier through and through and he sort of came through the ranks of the army? Or was he an outsider that staged a coup? What's the story of how sort of 1989 started?
Yeah, so before the coup of 1989, Sudan had a transitional government in place. And that transitional government, quite similar to the transitional government we see now in modern times in Sudan, was a parliamentary government that were debating big issues, constitutional issues about what the country's future would look like. That transitional period didn't last long, similar to the one that we have now, because Bashir was part of officers' class. He wasn't very high-ranking, but he was part of an officers' class in Sudan's army. And he staged the coup, which he referred to as the National Salvation Movement. Sorry, that might be wrong. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah. So he was an army officer that rose through the ranks. And he ended up executing the coup with several of his counterparts. What people say, and what a lot of historians would argue, is that Bashir's coup was quite distinctive because of the Islamic nature of it. And it was heavily influenced, and some even say orchestrated, by a famous Islamic thinker called Hassan al-Turabi. Hassan al-Turabi came into the scene alongside Bashir, and what they did is basically reshaped this vision of Sudan. That's not to say that Islamism didn't exist in Sudan before. Islamism has a very long history in Sudan and existed during the Numeri period. But we see it really penetrating the state when Bashir's Revolutionary Command Council, or RCC, took power in 1989.
Yeah, I think you're right about the National Salvation.
Okay.
Yeah. So he takes over in 1989. And his, correct me if I'm wrong, he's overthrown in 2019, right?
Yes.
So that 30-year period, how was that 30-year period connected to what's happening right now?
So I would say the 30-year period is connected to what's happening right now in various amount of ways. The first being that 30 years is a long time for a regime to solidify itself within the state. And I mean security-wise, economically, politically, socially, in many, many ways. So what we see happening in that 30-year period, and almost immediately after 1989, is Bashir uprooting several, whether that be political personnel, the security sector, controlling all the economic hot points. And we see that he instilled the country with loyalists to him and loyalists to his regime. This is something that continued to the point where, for many people, it was either we align with the regime or we have no livelihood. a lot of businesses started to turn to work with Bashir. From that point on, Sudan continues sort of its long history of conflict as well. So notably, and tragically as well, in 2003, we see the height of the conflict in Darfur, which in many ways was impacted or led by the Janjaweed, now formalized as the RSF. These were fighters who we see now as the RSF, led by Hemeti, who were appointed by Bashir to counter the insurgencies in Darfur. We also see continuous conflicts in the south of Sudan, leading to South Sudan's independence in 2011 as well as several attempts of the Bashir regime to continue to solidify itself, whether that's militarily or economically throughout Sudan's history. But something that we hadn't seen before and that we've only just seen this last month is fighting in Sudan's urban capital, Khartoum. And this is something that's been unprecedented.
So let's talk a little bit about that. On the ground, like, what does it actually look like now versus, these different points of turmoil over the last decade?
Yeah, so speaking specifically about Khartoum right now, Khartoum has seen unrest in the past. It's seen coup attempts being the political capital of the country. It's seen protest movements, but it's never seen armed conflict to this degree. Khartoum is, like any city, a bustling capital where many people come from the peripheries into the capital to support themselves in making a living. Khartoum isn't without its problems. It has been suffering from the economic turmoil and inflation, which were one of the reasons why people staged an uprising in 2018 and 2019 in response to reforms by Bashir's government, economic reforms by Bashir's government. But what we're seeing now is almost a complete devastation of the capital. I'm talking about massive shortages of food, fuel, medical supplies. Most of the hospitals in the country are destroyed. Mass lootings of people's homes. Of course, unfortunately, we're also seeing injuries and deaths. And we're seeing also a mass exodus of people leaving Khartoum, whether to go to neighboring cities in Sudan or to leave the country altogether. And of course, that comes with a lot of privilege. Those who have the means to leave definitely have the means to sustain themselves as well. But for many, that's not the reality. For most of the country, that's not the reality. We're talking about 40 million people. And the fighting doesn't just stop in Khartoum. It has continued throughout the country as well, most notably in Darfur. Darfur has witnessed incredible amounts of violence. Darfur's infrastructure is weaker than Khartoum's as well, and has been impacted by a long legacy of conflict since the early 2000s. So although the numbers there, it's more difficult to get official numbers in Darfur, but the estimates are that the death tolls and the injuries are far, far higher than in Khartoum.
Geez. In preparation for this, I was looking to figure out, okay, when did this latest stretch start? And as far as I could tell, it sort of erupted April 15th. Was there a sort of a triggering point? Was there something that happened? And obviously these things can be tiny, like when the sort of uprising in Lebanon that started in October was like over. So it was supposed to be over this like WhatsApp attacks. So they can be really tiny events that start these huge forest fires. What happened on the 15th of April?
So I think to understand what happened on the 15th of April, we should kind of trace the roots back to the October 2021 coup. So Sudan until October 2021 was led by a civilian government alongside the Sovereignty Council. This Sovereignty Council had Hemeti, the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, and Burhan, the leader of the Sudanese army, as the heads of this Sovereign Council. What we ended up seeing happening in October 2021 was a coup that forcefully removed civilians and under the guise of this isn't working and we need the military and the sovereign council and people with the proper quote unquote experience to deal with this situation. So then what we ended up seeing is that there was discussions throughout this period of a political framework agreement, of a constitution that could lead the country into a democratic transition, and then finally elections. But what ended up happening is you had Burhan and Hemeti, the two main players in this scenario, arguing about several different factors. And to understand what factors they're talking about, we really need to delve into security reform and the history of security reform in Sudan. But for the sake of our listeners, I think it's important to note that the RSF itself was a creation of the Sudanese armed forces. They were empowered by the Sudanese armed forces. So when discussions started erupting about integration and what the security reform should look like in Sudan and what sort of power should this RSF, who are like a paramilitary force, what sort of power should they have and what sort of powers should the Sudanese armed forces have, that created a tension between Burhan and Hemeti. We see these tensions sort of arising as both players ally themselves with different international actors. We also see these tensions arising based off of speeches on the ground, attending meetings separately, and discussions about the framework agreement itself.
Yeah. Aida, can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
Can you paint a picture of who these two people are?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Because I'm also like trying to understand their perspectives, their individual perspectives and references, and what they themselves may be fighting for, and causes and relationships that they are, that their perspectives are governed by. And so, yeah, help me understand, paint a picture.
So, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the commander of the Sudanese armed forces, he's a military commander who was working under Bashir throughout Bashir's regime. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, along with his allies, were responsible during the revolution for actually removing Bashir from office. So they actually removed him from office in the midst of the protests and came forth as we're going to control the country, very, very similar to what we've seen happen in Sudan's history in the 20th century. But protesters intervened and eventually got them to negotiate with civilians to have a civilian government.
Yeah. Can I ask you other questions real quick about these two? Are there like intergenerational things, or are they of the same generation? Are there class differences or sort of like geography differences as well? Or are they? Yes. Yeah. So yeah, help me understand.
Yeah. So Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is very much considered kind of a Khartoum elite. Hemeti has quite an interesting background. He came from an area next to the border between Chad and Darfur in Western Sudan. So Hemeti had more humble upbringings. And Hemeti actually rose through the ranks. I mean, there's several different accounts of how he rose through the ranks. Some say he was a camel herder. Some reports say that he was a highwayman. So there's conflicting reports about how he actually rose through the ranks and what his exact background is. But what is confirmed is that he came from humble beginnings, a humble family. And when the Janjaweed, because at the time they were known as the Janjaweed, and some people still refer to them as the Janjaweed, were rising through the ranks, particularly kind of in the 1990s, through empowerments through Libya and Chad. Bashir got Hemeti to start to lead the rapid support forces. He made him the head of the Janjaweed in 2003 and gave him a lot of responsibility to control the insurgency in Darfur, because he came from a prominent tribe there that had a lot of influence. But then I guess the differences between Burhan and Hemeti are quite interesting, because what people are saying is that Hemeti comes from a history of being isolated because he's not from Khartoum, because he's from the Western Darfur region. He's considered to be, from the peripheries, didn't finish elementary school. So there is also this dynamic of they're the Janjaweed or the militia and their leader Hemeti being kind of, I suppose, less than Khartoum political elites and the army, because the army is a very prestigious institution in Sudan has a very strong history, and there's a lot of training that goes into being part of the army, whereas the RSF and Hemeti are kind of seen as this fringe militia group that came to light because Bashir just needed them to control something in Darfur. But I think people underestimated the amount of power and strength that Hemeti and the RSF actually managed to have.
Mm. And if you were tracking like popular support, I'm not asking you to give me numbers, but if you were to sort of guess how popular support for these two sort of groups has changed over time, do you feel like it's been pretty static? And there are some people who are always in this camp and some people who are always in this camp, and has pretty much stayed sort of static at whatever levels they are? Or over the course of the last few years, do you feel like there have been like wild fluctuations in popularity?
I think it depends a lot on the geography of Sudan and who you ask. So specifically, as I mentioned previously, the RSF and the Janjaweed have devastated Darfur. And so they're not necessarily seen as the protectors of Darfur. They're seen as the militia that caused violence and were strongly responsible for the genocides and conflicts that occurred in that region. I will say that I think a big portion of Khartoum's population during the genocide and during the conflict in Darfur were unfortunately almost oblivious to the conflicts that were occurring in that area. So in terms of the opinions that people necessarily had, I think that really boils down to the individual. But I would say that what we're seeing kind of right now, especially on the ground, and again, this comes from a perspective of, I am someone who's outside of Sudan, so I don't want to speak for people that are in the country, but based off of interviews that I've been watching and things that I've been reading, a lot of the attacks that are happening in residential areas or looting and things like that are done by the RSF. Kind of more on the ground work is done by the RSF, entering into civilian houses and things like that. And because of that, I think the army has arisen to some people in the capital as the protector. Again, I think this traces back to the army's prestigiousness, the fact that it's a fully fledged governmental institution, when the RSF is still kind of seen as this militia. So I think that there's also a bit of that opinion attached to it as well.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I kept on interrupting you. So we were sort of inching towards April 15th, and you were giving me background, and then I kept saying, what about this? What about this?
Okay.
So, yeah, so inches closer to April 14th. April 15th, excuse me.
Yeah, so I think it's important to look at the October 2021 coup and the political period that immediately followed. What we did see is resistance committees, neighborhood committees in Sudan leading saying no to the coup protests. These sustained for months and months on end, organized by the heroic and incredible resistance committees throughout the country. But as those protests were happening, negotiations pushed by international actors with interest in Sudan, as well as Burhan Hemeti, started to discuss framework agreements or political settlements and transitional constitutions for the country in the hopes to lead to a democratic transition and elections for Sudan. What we then see happening are these tensions between Burhan Hemeti erupting on a various amount of issues. The one that's central, I think the most relevant to our listeners, is the question of security sector reform and kind of what to do with the RSF. Should they be integrated into the Sudanese armed forces within a fixed time period? And that's actually what the condition for the framework agreement was, that the RSF should be integrated into the Sudanese armed forces. The controversy now was how long should that take? And what should that integration look like? And how much power should Burhan or Hemeti get? And so these tensions of integration continue to brew over, I think particularly during March as well. We started to see them coming out, speaking about different things. We start to see rifts between them. And what we ended up seeing towards like right before April 14th is Hemeti moving his forces from Western Sudan to Khartoum, as well as to the city of Merowi, where the army was based with Egyptian troops.
Is it sort of, because this sounds so familiar to Lebanon. I mean, I'm calling you from Beirut, so I keep on making Lebanon parallels just because that's the world I live in. And so it sounds really similar. There's this Hezbollah, this armed forces outside of the government, and then there's the government army, and so there are similar parallels. But it's its own thing, and it's different. One question though is, do they have today, and have they always had ideological differences, or is it just like, listen, two different personalities. I'm with this guy, you're with that guy. And I just, it's like rooting for different sports teams. Like, I'm with this guy. That's the team. I like this color. You like that color. Or are there like different ideological differences that undergird their movements?
So I think they're very good at pointing the finger at each other for ideological differences. So
that's the job of the politicians.
Yeah. So I would say one of the biggest kind of pronunciations, or something that really had Sudanese people thinking about the past, is Hemeti saying that as these tensions were brewing, Hemeti pointing the finger at Burhan and his colleagues, saying that they're remnants of Bashir's regime. There's a lot of dialogue that we're seeing coming from official rapid support forces, social media, and interviews, that these guys are Islamists. These guys being the Sudanese armed forces. They're Islamists. They're being empowered by Bashir. They're being empowered by the remnants of the regime. On the flip side, we see less ideological, but I guess kind of more personal. We see a lot of the armed forces saying that the RSF are just kind of rogue militia. They just came from the dark ends of the Western Sudan and have now made it to the capital. We have to force them out. But I think the big issue here is it misses a lot of nuance, right? First of all, being that Hemeti and Burhan were once before holding hands and championing Sudan's transition and championing themselves as heads of state. That Hemeti and Burhan were both empowered by Omar al-Bashir and by the previous regime.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about broad misconceptions. So over the course of the last few weeks, people like me that you've come across who are trying to understand what's going on, what do you think the most what's the word I'm looking for? Persistent misconceptions are about where we are today and the path forward?
I would say like the biggest misconception or rhetoric that I'm hearing is that we just kind of ended up here, and that civilians, I mean being the civilians of Sudan, trusted these generals to have a successful democratic transition, and then they failed and we misplaced our trust. I think that ignores an enormous amount of the Sudanese population, particularly those part of resistance committees, those that have been protesting against Omar al-Bashir and those protesting against the coup, who warned international actors and who warned politicians that any negotiations with Hemeti and Burhan would not lead to a democratic transition. There was a fear that that by empowering both of these figures, which we've seen since 2019, that the empowerment of these types of figures, giving them more political status, legitimizing them, could lead to, a complete mess of how they control the power, how they decide to control the country. And I think people were really very much, and I'm saying this, I guess, because I'm a historian, but also because this is what history has told us, that this is almost a repeat of what we've seen in the past. Obviously, different actors and different players and things like that. But fundamentally, that a lot of these actors can be easily empowered by outside sources, and that civilian voices are incredibly important, and that for a long time they have been shut out. Meaningful civilian voices have been shut out. So
Yeah.
I just want to debunk that. Yeah.
So if somebody's listening to this and they're based in London or they're based in Morocco or Jeddah or Berlin or Japan, and they're interested in understanding who some of those civilian voices are, what are some of the organizations over the last few years that are, part of that civic society that might be worth checking out or even historically reading about?
Yeah, I would definitely, as of like present moment, check out the neighborhood resistance committees that exist throughout all of Sudan. They have come together throughout Sudan's history, particularly in the last couple of years. More formally in the last couple of years, I would say, to organize protests when they felt that the civilian voices within politics were failing them. And the reason why I point these ones out specifically is because they're authentic on-the-ground voices. Even today, in the middle of the conflict, they are playing a big role in mobilizing neighborhoods, helping people evacuate the country, helping supply houses with electricity, water, medicine, helping find missing persons. So they're really, really doing the work. What's unfortunate is that they're still being excluded from high-level discussions and consultations. And it's not to say that these people want to be politicians. Many of them don't. Their purpose is to support their people, the people in their communities, and to coordinate and mobilize efforts. So I would definitely check out the neighborhood resistance committees. You can find them on Twitter.
Is that's a term I've never heard before, neighborhood resistance committee. Is that a sort of a uniquely Sudanese structure? And how long is that one organization, or is it just this organic grassroots thing that exists?
Yeah, so resistance committees, it's not one organization, although they've come together to create frameworks. Some of them come together to create framework agreements and sort of have a united vision. I would say it's definitely a very unique Sudanese thing. Our neighborhoods and our neighbors are people that are very close to us, that we grew up with and that support us, not in times of conflict, but just kind of every day. So these resistance committees kind of came out in the hopes to mobilize civilians. They came out when they felt that the FFC, the Force of Freedom of Change, who were part of the transitional discussions, were failing them. And a loose version of them had existed before. So you will find that in a lot of neighborhoods in Sudan, there will be representatives of neighborhoods committees that meet there. They're fully self-funded. People are just really giving up their time, volunteering their time and their effort to support their neighborhoods, and then they do coordination efforts as well with each other. So that kind of grew out organically.
Wow, I mean, it's funny. So how many of these you think exist across the country?
Oh, it's definitely in the hundreds. I can't pinpoint the exact number, but there's definitely
it's essentially, you're just essentially describing a Congress.
Yeah, I mean, a Congress that's not too interested necessarily in participating in the politics. So it's interesting because I feel like they are interested in the political future of the country, and they are interested in having their voices heard. I mean, this is the point of it, to have their voices heard within like the country's political future, but they're not kind of power hungry politicians that individually want to have a seat in Sudan's parliament. I think what makes it super distinctive is that these are normal, everyday people. And a lot of them, the majority of them are very young. They're very, very young people, and they're putting in a lot of effort. And I think something that made me quite emotional and something that made me really proud to be Sudanese is when I was reaching out to some of them, asking for support for my family, or asking for updates on different areas, or asking if someone could support my like grandma in getting medicine or things like that. And these are the people that will step up. These are the people that will step up in those moments and do their best to support their communities.
Conflicts like this don't only affect, projects. They affect people. The people working on those projects. How have you sort of personally been affected by, or how's your relationship to your work been changed over the last, month. You're working on stuff that's so fundamentally focused on the future of Sudan. How's that changed?
It's been conflicting, yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head specifically because my work is very, very tied to what's going on at the moment. And being Sudanese and doing a PhD on Sudan, it kind of adds, because I'm deeply passionate about my work, but it's also incredibly personal to me. So I guess in a practical sense, I was meant to go to Sudan to do research there. I can no longer do that. But also more kind of on a personal level, it's incredibly difficult to research about the politics of your country when you're trying to evacuate your family from the country because of its politics. It's just it's been very emotional. I've definitely had to put my work on pause. Thankfully, I have very understanding and supportive networks that are completely fine with me doing that. But at the same time, I am motivated by the fact that I'm doing something that is relevant, something that I think would be of interest to people, something that I hope could serve as a guide. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about Sudanese political history. It's because of these trends. It's because of these dynamics that we have seen before. And I do think that a lot of the discussions we see from international players and in the political sphere might lack that historical understanding that I think is important in understanding countries like Sudan. So I'm confident that I'll be continuing my work because it's something I'm really passionate about, and I hope that it can serve some purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to know that your family is okay. But yeah, I mean, times like these, I would imagine that they like fundamentally change, not only in the short term, but in the long term, how, like your view on the Constitution. You're writing a dissertation on like basically how the government should function, and also like the shared values of a populace. And I wonder if that has also changed.
Yeah, I think this is something that I was questioning a lot, and unfortunately, I think my questions have been answered. That being kind of, what is the point of a constitution if it doesn't serve its people? Because the average Sudanese person, the average person isn't carrying around their country's constitution as a point of reference, let alone necessarily reading it to begin with. So I'm looking at what's sad is that I'm coming to terms with the fact that constitutions don't actually reflect people's popular imaginings for their country. And constitutions don't actually serve a purpose if the institutions that create them or the institutions that back them aren't inclusive, are extremely militarized, and don't platform kind of the social, economic, and political needs of the people. And Sudan specifically is an incredibly diverse country. People have a variety of different needs. People have a variety of different visions for how they want their country to look like. That's not to say that a constitution isn't important, but I think that a constitution should reflect the views of its people. So in these recent times, what I'm seeing now is these discussions about framework agreements, and the constitutions that were developed for interim periods can be written very easily, but also disposed of very easily. Because we're talking about a nation building project here, right? Like, this is something that takes years. I think that was one of the mistakes that international actors made in the current situation in Sudan, is it was too much of a rushed process. They were trying to secure a deal very quickly, and empowering the same people that are starting the conflict in the midst of that.
Who has done it well? I mean, you're a historian. Who can we historically, what are some, post-colonial success stories, if any, both on the African continent, in the global South, like however you want to cut out the globe, to be like, hey, where can we look at to say this is a possible success story?
I think the Kenyan constitution is a good success story. Again, this is relative, but I think Kenya did a very good job of kind of not participatory, but including quite a few voices in the country's constitutions, allowing for reasonable amendments when need be. And I think Kenya is a good example because Kenya was also colonized by the British. So something that I noticed when I was looking at my sources, and I think it boils down to a lot of different things like indirect rule versus direct rule and things like that happen in Sudan and Kenya. And so not to delve too much into that, but in Kenya, for example, they were able to construct a constitution post-independence. Sudan continued to be on a search for a constitution. And my sources, like my primary sources that I looked at the archives, the British specifically talk about the fact that they don't believe that the Sudanese are able to govern themselves, that is too diverse of a country, that they don't have the capabilities, and basically that they can't do it. And that they're going to need intense guidance in order to create that. When in Kenya, the discussions were kind of more organic and developed over time. But that's to say, in the same breath, that Kenya and Sudan are incredibly different countries, and both face very different challenges and opportunities. So I think, yeah.
No. Finish your thought. I have another question.
No, it's basically done.
So, we're like 45 minutes into the podcast and you haven't mentioned the word Egypt at all. And I'm curious about the legacy of sort of Egyptian Egyptian rule. I don't know what the noun is. But what is the legacy of Egyptian control over Sudan? Because that's something that differentiates Kenya and Sudan.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's not a coincidence, right? That we're set up in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do have Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which ruled Sudan from 1899 until Sudan gained independence. That being Egypt and Britain ruling Sudan equally as kind of like their territory. And a variety of different things happened, and it had a variety of different influences on Sudan. But I think the most relevant one for the listeners are twofold. First of all, ideologically, a lot of the political thought that Sudanese politicians had in the post-independence period was influenced by Egyptian political thinkers. Hassan al-Banna from the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, played a big role in influencing Islamist thought in Sudan. The second one being the army, and how the army was developed in Sudan. That was also strongly influenced by the Egyptian army, which has one of the strongest armies and largest armies in the region. They also influenced them. And what we started to see kind of in the run-up to the independence period is almost this struggle between the British and Egyptians of, do we give Sudan independence? Do we not? What kind of influence are we going to have over this country? And this is something the Egyptians in particular were very, very occupied with. Sudan was a place for them to get incredibly cheap labor. Sudan was a place for them to get a lot of imports and exports, as well as at the time it was the biggest country in Africa. So their influence there was quite strong, and of course, like the Nile and all of those water-related, I don't know the word, water-related factors. But I think something that's happening now, which kind of, I guess, also reaffirms Egypt's influence in the region, also Egypt's interest, is the Egyptians are strongly tied to the Sudanese armed forces. That's the side that they support. In the Arab League, they've been calling for immediate ceasefire and urging both sides to stop the fighting. And also this mass exodus of Sudanese people leaving Khartoum. A lot of them are going to Egypt. My family included went to Egypt by bus. And so there is also this fear of, first of all, the Egyptians have a fear of an influx of Sudanese refugees. So the fear of this humanitarian disaster. But the other fear is the conflict spillover into Egypt and in the other regions. So Egypt's influence on Sudan has never completely wavered. Yeah.
Okay, I want to end with a few recommendations. And I'm going to put you on the spot. I should have told you this beforehand, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Historically, if somebody wants to understand this history that we sort of just zoomed through, are there books, references, documentaries, sources that you think are must reads or must listens?
Yes, I think Civil Uprisings by Willow Berridge is an incredible book. It talks about Sudan's parliamentary periods and the civil uprisings that occurred in the run-up to Bashir taking over. I'm not saying that just because they're my supervisor. It is an incredible book. Another book I would read is a book titled The History of Sudan. I think that gives a good overview, and it's a good starting book for people that I think it's written by Daly, that gives an outlook on how we got here and the different kind of dynamics in the country as well. I would start with those two, definitely.
Nice. Is there anything about the last sort of the last 10 years? Has anyone published anything in the last 10 years that helps parse out what's happening, what's been happening lately?
There is a book. It's called Unfinished Democracy, by also Willow Berridge, Raja Makawi, and Justin Lynch. I think there might be one other author. I think it's Alex DeWall, if I'm not mistaken. That one talks about it's very contemporary. It talks about the last few years. And then When Peace Kills Politics, by Sharath Srinivasan. That one focuses on kind of negotiations in Sudan and South Sudan. I think that's also an incredible book.
Cool. Okay, I want to leave on a sort of forward-looking note. What do you think the next stretch looks like? And I will let you define what you think the next stretch is in terms of length and days and weeks and years.
It's a big question. I guess the next stretch for Sudan, or I would say my immediate hope, is obviously for the fighting to stop. People's safety and people's livelihoods are the most important thing. And like I said, most people can't leave the country. And even those who leave, they're kind of at a point where they're like, what's going to happen? That's my home. And will I be able to return? So the immediate hope is that in the next couple of weeks, international pressure, a couple of weeks might be ambitious, but I'm hoping international pressure really gets to both of these commanders and gets to them in a very strategic way, not in the ways that we've seen in the past by emboldening or empowering one over the other, and coming to a true ceasefire, because there's been several ceasefires over the last few weeks that have not held whatsoever throughout the country. My hopes for then after that is for a platform for civilians to be able to discuss what their popular imaginings are for their country, what they hope to see Sudan be, and for that to actually be listened to by the people who have influence in the country and people who have influence from outside of the country. I've always said that this wasn't going to be an easy transition to democracy because the regime that we uprooted had a chance to embed itself for 30 years. So that's not something that's going to be taken care of in a 2-year transition period. So I hope that we can exercise patience, and that the international community that's involved in Sudan exercises that patience, as well as advocates for transitional justice mechanisms, for supporting people economically and infrastructure-wise, given the current situation as well, and providing the much-needed humanitarian corridors and humanitarian relief throughout the entire country.
Well, I hope so too. Aida, I'm really, really thankful that you're able to take some time to talk to us. If people want to find you, they can find you online. Search for Aida Abbashar, and there's a page on the LSE's website, and they can find you there. Aida, thanks so much. This was really, really informative. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.